I've so far avoided talking in any detail about the Lucy Letby case. Operation Foxley says all those people who state that Lucy Letby is innocent here. Here is a question: would you trust Lucy with your own child? And I think that's an interesting question. She was accused of murdering 7 babies and attempting to murder 6 others. It's been widely covered in the press. But there are some arguments that question the safety of her conviction, suggesting she might be innocent and might be wrongly convicted. And I think this gets to the heart of one of the problems with our British legal system at the moment. It is so obsessed with its own importance that it's failing to realize, it fails to establish its purpose, which is to draw a line under things. And in so many ways, I've seen this recently with NHS whistleblowers. The judiciary seems so intent on supporting the establishment that it doesn't look at the issues. And if the information isn't presented in the right way, then it doesn't get a correct hearing. And that is wrong. Justice should be blind. And justice should be thorough. And the fact that there are questions outstanding about Lucy Letby tells us that that isn't the case in her trial. First of all, there seems to be a weakness of statistical evidence, and critics such as retired medical professionals and legal commentators have expressed concerns about the statistical evidence used in Letby's trial. The argument is that neonatal deaths and collapses, while tragic, are not necessarily indicative of malicious intent. Neonatal units often see such incidents due to the fragility of the babies being treated, and there is debate over whether the deaths can be conclusively linked to deliberate actions by any one particular nurse. The statistical abnormality that a large number of deaths occurred while Letby was on duty was a cornerstone of the prosecution, but critics argue that correlation doesn't imply causation. Professor Sir Richard Gill, a statistician, has argued that such clustering could be coincidental, given the high-risk environment of the neonatal unit. I would refer you, incidentally, to a case which is ongoing in Turkey, where a doctor who had served time in prison on Kurdish terrorist charges had somehow found himself at the center of a neonatal unit covering a number of different hospitals, and under his direction the most extraordinary scam was being conducted, where perfectly healthy babies were being siphoned off and put into neonatal units, intubated and so on, and eventually killed, simply to take money from the system for expensive medicines, which were then sold on the black market. It's a really shocking story, and significantly more shocking than the Lucy Letby story. And I'm amazed that it hasn't appeared in the British press anywhere. We seem to be unreasonably insular and unreasonably quick to make judgments on very flimsy evidence. The second point, really, in the Lucy Letby thing is the lack of evidence, the lack of direct evidence. One of the primary arguments for her innocence is the absence of direct evidence linking her to any of the alleged murders. No CCTV footage, no eyewitness testimony, no forensic evidence such as fingerprints or DNA was presented to directly implicate Letby. Much of the case against her relied on circumstantial evidence and medical expert opinions, which raises questions about whether the burden of proof was met. Certainly, the newspapers ganged up on her Even if the case should be overturned, the hatred which was manipulated by the press is extreme. How could she even return to her ordinary life? Defenders of letby argue that without direct proof of intent or action, the case may have rested too heavily on inference and expert opinion rather than hard facts. The third point is the medical complexity of the cases, and she worked on a neonatal unit where babies were already at high risk due to premature birth. I was a premature baby. My birth mother told me that I was 3 months premature, which I think is highly unlikely. She said, you were so small I used to bathe you in a soup bowl. My mother was given to flights of fancy. But I'm certainly pretty convinced I was at least 2 months premature, and that I would have spent some time in a neonatal unit. So I am very sympathetic. I also think that because I was so premature, this is why I have an issue on the haemophilia scale, and while there is no genetic link at all. So I'm very sympathetic to the plight of these babies. So I feel I'm in a position to be able to speak out in support of Lucy Letby in some form, precisely because I could easily have been one of those baby victims. The argument here is that the baby's underlying health conditions and the inherent risks of being in intensive care could explain the outcomes rather than deliberate actions by Lucy Letby. The fourth point is the hospital management failures, and those are extreme. And hospitals will not admit failure. And even when they do admit failure, as they sort of did to me, they don't offer any form of compensation or any way to put that right. Hospitals are run by a bevy of ill-organized bureaucrats, and mistakes seem to be factored into the into the daily routine of these organizations, these huge organizations. That isn't right. But to lay the blame for this bureaucratic mess on the shoulders of one individual, I can see very easily how that could have happened. It's the same sort of blame game which is played with the whistleblowers. The number of doctors who are the doctors for justice people, the numbers of people who have been caught up and who are accused of appalling things or have lost their jobs simply because they have called out the errors in the hospital management. Seeking a scapegoat. The hospitals is seeking a scapegoat to deflect attention from their own shortcomings. And internal hospital disputes, delayed reporting of issues to the police. These things should have raised suspicions about whether Letby was unfairly targeted to cover up much deeper systemic failure. The argument here is that she was a convenient figure to blame for institutional failings rather than being truly responsible for these deaths. The fifth point is that the expert witnesses themselves, some defence supporters have criticised the medical experts who testified against Letby, arguing that their opinions were not definitive and were based on speculative interpretations of medical evidence. There were disagreements among medical professionals about whether the deaths could be attributed to external causes or whether they were clearly the result of natural conditions. The use of expert testimony, particularly when experts themselves disagree, could certainly lead to wrongful convictions if the evidence presented is not beyond reasonable doubt. And I'm not convinced the Lucy Letby trial came to a clear conclusion that it was beyond reasonable doubt that she was guilty. Her own notes, which were used in the prosecution, the prosecution relied on handwritten notes found in her home, in which she seemed to incriminate herself, writing things like, "I am evil and I did this." Well, that doesn't mean, the fact that you write something doesn't mean that you did it. This is the same issue that lies behind the inappropriate use of drill music lyrics to imprison, to incarcerate rap singers. That is wrong. This is wrong. Some supporters argue that the notes could reflect her emotional turmoil rather than her guilt, her grief rather than her guilt. And the psychological context of the notes, written in a highly stressful environment, may have been misinterpreted, misrepresented, or misunderstood as confessions. I think she took things very personally, and I don't think that she was necessarily guilty. She may have felt guilty. That doesn't mean she was guilty. Some of Letby's supporters point to the high-pressure environment of the NHS, particularly in understaffed neonatal units where burnout and stress are common, and her defence claimed that she was dedicated and hard-working, but that such environments can produce psychological distress. And that surely is what we see in these notes. I am evil, I did this. Critics would say that instead of addressing the systemic issues within the NHS, the blame was placed on an individual because she was there. And this is about the culture of overwork and emotional pressure that may well have contributed to Lucy Letby's distress. The MP David Davis has taken up her case, and I think is as convinced as I am that her guilt is not proven, and the guilty verdict is perhaps an irresponsible one, and this casts doubt on the judiciary as well as the NHS, and we know the NHS is struggling. So while Lucy Letby has been convicted, the arguments surrounding her innocence focus on the circumstantial nature of the evidence, the reliance on very strange expert opinion rather than direct proof, and the potential mismanagement or the potential failings within the hospital itself, which haven't been thoroughly examined. Critics of the conviction argue that there is room for reasonable doubt, and the conviction should have been based on beyond reasonable doubt, and that an appeal or a deeper inquiry into the hospital's conduct could potentially reveal issues with the case against her. And we should move more speedily. There's been a lot of evidence recently of people who have spent many, many years incarcerated when the case against them was weak. We now know the case is weak. The case requires some sort of review. We need to be honest. The judiciary itself needs to be honest and humble and recognize that it owes the world, it owes her a review, and it owes itself a review if it wants to hold its head high. We need to put the law back in its proper place at the top of our society, and at the moment people are scraping their boots on it because it is not to be trusted, and that is a worrying position, and partly because it's become unduly politicized and unduly influenced by the media, and of course it's always had a tendency to pomposity.